Education, Children, Families, and COVID-19, a set of virtual panels hosted by the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier, in partnership with the Division of Education and Counseling and the Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities Research and Education in the College of Pharmacy at Xavier University of Louisiana. My name is Dr. David Robinson Morris, and I'm the founding director for the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit, your convener and co-moderator for this important discussion regarding public health, public education, not public health. Let me tell you a bit about the center. The Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit was founded in August of 2018 as a response to our calling as the nation's only Black and Catholic institution of higher learning. And just one way we at Xavier put our knowledge into practice toward the creation of a more just and humane society. Focusing our efforts on crystallizing community, research, and activism within the areas of educational equity, criminal justice reform, and environmental justice, the center serves as a present point of intersection that brings together 95 years of our history at Xavier, working to combat and dismantle oppressive systems, triumphing in the face of adversity, and reclaiming our shared humanity, while educating human beings who go out into the world ready to do justice always and in all ways. Today's panel is another glimpse of what we attempt to do to inform and galvanize while impacting policy, changing practice, and most especially uplifting the human spirit. Our first distinguished panel will look at this topic, K-12 public education, specifically from a national level, while the panel that will follow immediately after will dive deeper into the issues at the local level. The series of panels seeks to answer two overarching questions. The first, how will we ensure safe and equitable educational delivery in the midst of this global pandemic? The second, how might we use trauma-informed, culturally relevant pedagogy to catalyze healing for deeply traumatized Black and minoritized students within the education space? Here's what I know. COVID-19 has exposed grand disparities across every sector. These disparities are not new, nor are they a secret to Black and brown people. Education is one of those sectors where the inequities along the lines of race and class have been clear for decades, and they stand to widen if not properly addressed in this social and political moment. Today's panel will explore all of these issues, and I'm sure so much more. Tynesha Fields, Community Engagement and Outreach Coordinator in the Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities Research and Education, will help to facilitate and intersperse audience questions and answers. Thank you, Tynesha. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Please be mindful not to use this function as a chat feature. Panel organizers are working behind the scenes to review questions and provide them to Tynesha as we progress through the panel discussion. Now let me turn it over to my co-moderator, Dr. Renee Akbar, Associate Professor in the Division of Education and Counseling at Xavier, to get us started. Dr. Akbar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robinson Morris. I want to thank you and Tanisha and Karen for putting on this great panel discussion. It's a very important topic that we must discuss in light of COVID-19 and the progress of Black and brown children in our public education systems. So I'd like to introduce the first panel before we begin with the questions. And the panelists include Dr. Cade Brumley, who is the Louisiana State Superintendent of Education. He just began his job like two minutes ago. So this is going to be to hear from him is going to be great, so we can hear what the state is doing to prepare our students and our teachers for our education in the next couple of months. Then we have Doctor, maybe that's a sign, Representative Duplessis. He is our state representative, and he's in the Louisiana House District 90. We also have Deidre Johnson Burrell, who is a program officer from Kellogg Foundation. And we also have Dr. Gloria Lansing-Billings, who is the Professor Emerita of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we all know her from her great work around culturally relevant pedagogy. So now that we have introduced our panelists, we are now going to begin with the first question. And so the first question is dead on about COVID-19. I guess if I was a parent, I know that I would be stressing right now about whether or not to send my child to a brick and mortar school. But I also will be stressing because I know that the importance of him or her being at a brick and mortar school, not just for the academics, but also for the social interactions. So my question for each of you is this: how do we refocus the current political narrative and place our thoughts and actions on the well-being of our children in their education? And we ask this question because this whole issue about masking or not masking or sending your child to school or not sending your child to school has become highly politicized. So we ask this question about how do we refocus this political agenda so that all of our thoughts and our energy are on the well-being of our children? And any of you could take that question.
I'll start because I guess we're talking about it from a political angle, and I'll go ahead and take the first shot at it. Dr. Akbar, you know, when you began the question about how do we change the political narrative, my initial response is that it should not even be a political narrative. Right. This shouldn't even be a political discussion. Should be something that we should all, even if we don't all agree on it, we should all agree on the fact that we care about what's in the best interest of our children. And the fact that it has become politicized is foundationally problematic. So I just want to point that out. It shouldn't even be a political narrative. Too often, the issues around education and what's in the best interest of our children, too often those issues have become politicized. And I think that's been the greatest tragedy. At the onset of this pandemic, I shared a great sense of optimism that this would be something that people from all races, all political perspectives, all regions, we could come together and put politics aside for once. But unfortunately, we see that just the opposite has happened. So I think right now the politicians need to do more listening. Even though I was the first one to speak, I think we need to do more listening to the parents, to the educators, and not try to get out in front per se, and really listen to the experts on these issues and not make it so political. So that's really just my initial thought on it, because as long as it's my philosophy is better than your philosophy, I think the children are going to continue to suffer. And we do need to acknowledge that this is a very complex and nuanced issue that no one has ever faced with. There is no guidebook, and there is no how-to on dealing with this. So we need to recognize the sensitivities of sending our children back to school too soon. We also need to recognize the sensitivities and dangers of them not going back to school, and there are arguments on both sides. So everybody needs to be sympathetic and understanding that this is a very challenging issue. We need to put our politics aside.
Thank you. Dr. Brumley, Dr. Lansing-Billings, Dr. Johnson-Burrell.
So, Dr. Akbar, whereas Representative Duplessis was telling us, and your question really talks about focusing, in some ways I want to broaden the conversation. We are not really in one pandemic. Now we have one that's really pressing on us, which is COVID-19. Mm-hmm. But we are essentially in the midst of 4 pandemics. We have the COVID-19, but we also have the whole discourse around race and racism that we have seen come across this country in the wake of the tragic death of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. But we also have a coming economic pandemic. You guys are situated in a city known for its tourism. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to be there to know that the Marriott and the Sheraton, all those places are not overflowing.
Right.
So there's money that is not coming into your city and state coffers. And that's just one example, but the entire nation, indeed the world, is going to suffer this economic downturn. Then the fourth one, which we don't like to talk about, but seemingly people in Louisiana should be talking about it all the time, is the coming climate catastrophe. Mm-hmm. You have had more storms, more intense storms. You have suffered in ways that the rest of the nation doesn't even know about. Much of my family is on the West Coast. They've suffered these fires. We've had towns totally wiped out. So all of this is happening at the same moment. And if we don't sort of get our heads wrapped around the fact that we're in a new global environment that's going to call for a lot of things. And so one of the things that I've been really pressing these last couple of months is what I've called the need for a hard reset. Mm-hmm. Now, what I mean by that, each and every one of you have got one of these things in your pocket somewhere, right? We live by these things. And when they don't do what we want them to do, you know, you may go online and find a support group to give you some ideas. If that doesn't work, you have to drag yourself to that store, whether it's the Apple store, the Android, Samsung, whatever store, and somebody, a teenager, 17 years old in a t-shirt is going to tell you your device needs a hard reset. What that person means by that is if you haven't backed up everything, mm-hmm. they're going to do something to that device. And when they return it to you, it's going to be like it left the factory. It will have no pictures. It will have no contacts on it. It'll be like starting over. That's where I think we are with our schools. When people say we need to get back to normal, I can tell you for the kids for whom I am most invested, going back to normal is not the answer because normal was where the problem was. Mm-hmm. Going back to school means I go back to the low reading group. I go back to high suspension rates. I go back to being expelled. Go back to being seen as the troublemaker. No, we need to be in a place where we start afresh. And I've spent the last few months looking at examples of catastrophic things that have happened in nations and what did they do to start over. So at World War II Japan, they did not go back to what they'd been doing before. They said what we were doing got us into this mess where we're out here trying to bomb people. They put a focus on co-education that they hadn't had. They didn't care about educating girls before World War II. They reorganized the organization of their schools and went to what looks more like a US organization of elementary, middle, and high. Similarly, in Italy, they said as a nation, we are not trying to raise another nation of fascists because they almost wiped us off the face of the earth. We want to do something new. And so their hard reset was the development of what's known as the Reggio Emilia preschools, which are the best preschools in the world, bar none. We send our teacher educators to look at these schools. So the question I think for us as a nation is, will we have the moral courage to have a hard reset, to rethink this, redo this? Now, New Orleans is an interesting place because you already had a glimpse of this post-Katrina, except all the people wanted to go back and weren't thinking about doing anything new. And the people who wanted to do something new did it, but they didn't do it in conjunction with community. Mm-hmm. They didn't do it the way you wanted it done. And now you're trying to unravel that. So this is a time not for the current leadership, whether it is political or school, to figure out how we get back to what we used to do, because what you used to do wasn't working. It's now time for that leadership to say, what's the new thing that we have to do to ensure that our kids get the education? And I'm going to be quiet because I done got my little stuff out. So.
Thank you very much. So that's going to segue me right to Dr. Brumley to ask him, in light of this conversation, Dr. Brumley, and in light of the pandemic, in light of the racial issues that we're now being confronted with, how do you think differently about schools now and how we do the business of schools and how we do schooling? How do you think about it now?
So First of all, I'd like to just thank you for including me in the conversation, especially with such esteemed guests that are on the call here today. You asked the first question about politics, and I'm glad Representative Duplessis jumped in and I did not, because I tell people all the time, I'm not a politician. I just live in a political world. So I'm an educational leader. That's how I would describe myself. My entire background has been working in public schools, trying to help kids get better outcomes and better opportunities. All of those schools have been title schools, serving students of the highest need. And so that for me has been an honor and a blessing as well. But I was interested in listening to Dr. Latson-Billings speak, because I had in my notes of preparation, I had described the intersection of a number of different challenges. I did not include the climate challenge. I'm glad you included that, but I had included social and civil unrest, economic uncertainty, the global health pandemic. Two that I did not hear her share, but I think are also important, are technological deployment in new ways. And then all of that wrapped around to or intersecting with national elections that are taking place that create even more uncertainty and discourse. So here at the department, and I have been on this job for about 2 months, coming in, there could not be a better time to take such a job. But one of the things that we have tried to do is recognize that we are not an experts on this virus. We are educators, we are administrators, we play the various roles that individuals in the state agency play. And those are not being an expert in the virus. But what we have had is the opportunity and the access to some of the best professionals, medical professionals who have studied and have been working with this virus. For us in Louisiana, we'll know these people. They're our Department of Health. They're Ochsner's Hospital. They're Children's Hospital of New Orleans. They're Tulane Medical Center. And so they have given us an extreme amount of access to ask them questions, collaborate with them, and work our way through many of the political conversations that have taken place, such as face coverings. We have said that we will allow the science to drive our decisions as we set minimum standards, and that's what we did. At the State Department, we made a recommendation to our state board around a set of minimum recommendations on group size, transportation, face coverings, sanitation, equipment that an employee would have to go back to work. And these were a set of minimum standards, recognizing that systems throughout the state and communities throughout the state look different, and they have different nuances. And so now, maybe more than ever, certainly in the last decade, local leadership is really going to matter. And people taking those minimum standards, you can certainly be more aggressive in terms of the safety of students, but taking those standards and making sure that they're taking place so that we do have minimum safety requirements being met in our schools. But then there's the whole other piece that we still have to recognize, and we're not talking enough about, and that's the academic loss of children, or the lack of academic gains, and the trauma that children are going to have whenever they come back to school, whether that's coming back to a computer or coming back to brick and mortar. So there are just a ton of questions out there that need to be discussed. There's a ton of questions that we're trying to answer, but we are going to learn so much over the next few months about schooling in Louisiana and schooling through America. And I just hope we take those experiences and innovate and certainly end up in a better place post this virus.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So Deirdre Johnson-Burrell, I won't say you're coming in at the end of this particular conversation, but I do have a question for you that we could wrap up this particular part of the conversation. And so what advice would you give to policy makers and to district leaders about how we can best serve our children in this pandemic, as well as all the other catastrophic events that we just heard about that are intersecting at this point?
Thank you, Dr. Akbar. Let me first, before I move into answering this question, thank the center for the invitation, but for hosting this conversation. This is, the center is developed for such a time as this. So thank you so much for creating this space and your leadership. And I'll just underscore some of what has already been said. I do think that when I think about this moment, I have a bit of a more optimistic glance, to be honest. Inequity is absolutely real. And we are absolutely seeing the exacerbation. Anytime there's a pandemic or anything that major happens in this country, BIPOC communities experience those things disproportionately. We know that. That being said, there is I really am considering this time sacred time and fertile soil. And I think we have seen that, like, there are things that have happened in the past 4 months that heretofore were beyond reach. So if we just, like, in 5 minutes, we decided we were going to throw high stakes accountability out the window. In 5 minutes, we decided we put a laptop in every kid's hand and give them a Wi-Fi. In 5 minutes, we decided that we could figure out how to bring in the homeless off the street, and so that they could be protected from the pandemic. And in that short time, we also, figured out or did a trial run with minimum basic income, right? Also in that time, and at great price, we pulled back the veil in a very different way on America's journey around race, right? And so we have had scholars for literally centuries trying to bring visibility to the invisible experience of being minoritized in this country, right? And suddenly, like in mainstream, we're talking about institutional, structural racism, white supremacy culture. So we have language and all of those things for me create tools and possibilities. And so to go to Dr. Billings' point and to Dr. Brumley's point, that we really have an opportunity to innovate in this moment, that we do need a hard reset. So for all of us who have been rethinking and reimagining what is possible, in education, this is the moment to try that on, as I see it, right? And so I would say, let's not double down on accountability, but let's double down on flexibility. How do we center community as we begin to build solutions and responses to this? I think the point we learned a hard lesson in New Orleans about how, like, not listening to community and the price of that. So let's not do that again. Let's build together with community. So I'd say to policymakers, as our representative so eloquently said, talk less, listen more, build with the people. And this is a pivot moment. So let us look toward what is possible in expanding more equitable education.
Thank you very much.
To follow up on that, sorry, Dr. Akbar, we did get a question from an audience member, and Ms. Johnson-Burrell, you began touching on this, but I'd like to still ask David Terry's question that says, if we indeed need a hard reset, how do we engage the parents, teachers, community to take the lead? And you all have kind of touched on this, to take the responsibility for constructing this new reset in their own hands, instead of allowing or letting politicians and wealthy try to create their own self-serving idea of a reset, which is proven to serve best only a small percentage of students, which are usually their own. And so that can go to any of you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would just say that this is going to take an unprecedented level of community engagement. We are no longer in a place where we can just depend on our representatives. So whether it's going to be community listening, engaging with established community groups, which, I happen to know that New Orleans is filled with them. So I can't talk about the whole state, but I know, having supervised a couple of dissertations that focused on New Orleans, there's a lot of community groups there. So the other thing that I think that we don't want to lose sight of, schooling is a part of education. Mm-hmm. This is probably going to be the first time that we can engage so many other institutions and agencies in the education of our children. Mm-hmm. Here in Madison, I sit on a bunch of boards. I chair the Urban League of Greater Madison. I'm on the United Way board. I'm on the Madison Children's Museum board. and we're all sort of scuffling to what we do in this moment. And I said, why are we all doing this stuff separately? We know, for example, we're not sending our kids back to school full time in Madison. In fact, it's going to be all virtual for the first quarter. We're probably going to slowly add face-to-face meetings, which may involve some kids going to school 3 days a week or 2 days a week. Well, what about those other days? Where is a place for our libraries and our museums and our community centers to be full partners in education, as opposed to just thought of as after school or care centers? We've got to get creative with this thing. And, I think, I just have the faith that the parents do know what they want for their children. They may not articulate it in the way that those of us who have initials after our names do it, but they know. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's no need to make new organizations. If you've got robust NAACPs and urban leagues and every other Divine Nine links, you got all of these people who meet at least once a month. You have a network and you have incredible church support. Mm-hmm. Let's plug into these networks to talk about how can we as a community educate our children, not expecting schools do a part, but let's not have them do it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to almost stand up and just say church. To Dr. Ladson Billings, I absolutely agree. I think that if we, like this, again, in this pivot moment, like we have all the resources we need. This is the opportunity to braid those resources in a powerful way. The only thing we need is creativity and ingenuity. So I wanted to add to my earlier comment that I would say, like, be flexible with the money, more money and be flexible with it. I would also say that to the policymakers. But I do think, how do we create, whether it's Zoom meetings, but pulling together the diverse array of organizations, not just the stakeholders that are friends, even some of the frenemies, bring them all into the discourse to strategize about how do we use the plethora of resources we have in this community to help serve our students, from public access television to radio to our libraries. Like, we can all be in this for our children, right? So we don't have to just rely on formal schooling.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to do what all good teachers do, Dr. Ladson Billings. I'm going to steal your theme, hard reset. That's going to be our theme moving forward. All right, and so really like that. So Dr. Duplessis, I won't make you a doctor yet, Representative Duplessis. So in talking about hard reset and also talking about innovation, you recently filed a resolution in the state of Louisiana, House Resolution number 55, which calls for the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education in the state of Louisiana to study the history of racism. Your resolution also calls for the creation of a task force to develop recommendations for implementation. What has been the reception of your resolution by your colleagues in the State House? And should we be pushing for the same kinds of research and exploration at the state and district levels?
Sure. Well, first, you really want to give me the doctor title. So Dr. Robinson Morris, you have to stop inviting me to be a part of these panels, all of these PhDs. But to that point, I was having a discussion with a friend of mine. So I do have a JD. So we were saying, just being a Juris Doctor, does that technically make me a doctor? Yes, the answer is no. The answer is no. I'm definitely not.
It's supposed to.
No. But with respect to the resolution, I just kind of talk about how I came to decide to file that, and then I'll talk about the reception. I think the last part of the question was my thoughts on the local/district level. Mm-hmm. So I'll just rewind briefly to the most recent celebration of Juneteenth. And at that time, we were about 2 weeks, we may have had about a week and a half or 2 weeks left in the special legislative session. So I think everybody on this panel would agree that we had probably not seen the level of emphasis or highlighting or celebration of Juneteenth that we've probably ever seen as a nation after this recent one that we just celebrated. And I think we can point to recent events in society, particularly the George Floyd incident, that and the protests that resulted from that, and the calls for equity and the calls for social justice and the calls for recognizing that Black Lives Matter, that we had never seen the cries on the level that we saw them most recently. So around that time, I began to ask myself a few questions, because you can turn on any television or you're looking at ads being promoted, and there's this theme around celebrating Blackness and these themes around celebrating history. And as someone who I went to elementary school in Orleans Parish Public Schools and then matriculated through Catholic high schools, I started to ask myself, what was my understanding, what was my experience of race relations in America through my experience as a student, as a grandson of someone who taught history and social studies and civics in the Orleans Parish Public School system throughout his 30-year teaching career. What was my experience? What did I really learn about these difficult issues of race in America? And honestly, the answer, it wasn't good enough, because I couldn't point to any moment in my development where I felt like the issues of how this nation, quote unquote, became great, how we talk about what really took place in our economic advancement over the course of those many centuries, that one race of individuals was systemically oppressed. How do we talk about that in our schools? So I reached out to some education leaders here in New Orleans to begin kind of kicking around the idea. And I think Dr. Brumley had literally just gotten hired maybe the day before. So I thought this might be a good way to introduce myself and say, hey, this is something that I'm interested in working on. So I started reaching out to some folks and thought that we could just ask the question on how we are teaching, how we're talking about race relations, the history of race relations in America. And then once we answer that question, to move forward in more of an action-oriented way of how do we develop an anti-racist curriculum. And that's where the task force and everything sort of came in. Now, I mentioned the fact that we have only had about 2 weeks left in session, so there wasn't a whole lot of time to really move this thing through both chambers, just from a legislative process standpoint. But the initial reaction, I can't say that it was a negative reaction, but I'll call it an interesting reaction, because the reaction that you receive, or that I received rather, from many of my colleagues is, we like this, we want to work on this, this is something that we're committed to working on. But in almost the exact same sentence, you're met with, well, we're not so comfortable with the language. So we want to work on the issue, but we're not really comfortable with the language that's in your resolution. And I think that presents a real poignant challenge that we have to overcome. And that is, it basically reveals what I was just talking about around the difficulty that presents itself when we're trying to deal with this issue around talking about race. We all acknowledge that there's a problem, but we can't agree on how to go about dealing with this problem. So the only language that was in the resolution, it was all factual information. There was nothing opinionated. At least I didn't think there was anything opinionated in the resolution. But some of my colleagues seem to have some challenges with talking about the historical issues that led us to where we are. But they'll still say, well, but this is something that we want to work on. So the instrument was introduced on the second to last day of the session ending. So I decided that I would work with the House Education Committee and the other chamber, the Senate chamber, to begin more of a long-term approach to this, because we just basically couldn't get it through in time. So hopefully there'll be an interim process that we can develop, and that's something that we're working on right now, to begin a study committee through the House Education Committee, and I'm working with Chairman Garafalo on that, we'll see what happens between now and when we return to session in Baton Rouge. But in between that time, I'm already talking with folks at the Department of Education, Dr. Kelly Peterson on Dr. Brumley's staff. We've already begun this conversation around what DOE can do. I've begun working with members at the Bessie level to see what Bessie can do to begin looking at this, because honestly, they don't have to wait on the legislature to ask them to study this. This is something that they can do on their own, and this is something that I'm publicly asking them to do, and I'm looking forward to working with them on this issue because quite honestly, I think it was Dr. Ladson Billings, I can't remember who mentioned the in Italy, the practices to prevent any future fascism, and how we have to make sure that history is being taught in a way where history doesn't repeat itself. And that's really the idea. And I want to be clear when we're talking about teachings through a lens of equity, it's not solely for the purpose of educating Black children, as though Black children have been miseducated. We have to make sure that our white colleagues and our white counterparts are being taught history in an accurate way, because we've seen enough when we talk about these symbols of racism and symbols of white supremacy. I believe more than anything, we have to make sure that our white students are being properly educated around the history of where we are in this nation. So I just want to make sure we make that point because we don't want history to repeat itself. So on a local level, absolutely. I think we need to be promoting this as well. I think local districts should embrace this. And honestly, the work is really going to fall at the feet of the local districts. And I know the Orleans Parish School Board had passed a resolution back in June to start looking at policies around equity, but I know that I've kind of gone on longer than necessary, but you asked me a few questions in that. So I'm trying to be thorough in my answer. But people want to help. They say, look, we want to help, but a lot of folks just aren't comfortable with some of the language that when you try to put the honest language in these instruments.
Thank you very much. So with regards to educational equity, Dr. Brumley, nationally, we know that there are gaps in access and equity for marginalized and minoritized communities. In fact, a recent report from the Opportunity Agenda, a social justice communications lab, asserted what we already know: reopening schools will disproportionately affect Black and Brown and people of color students. With that in mind, at the state level, what measures are being put in place to maintain excellence in access to educational delivery? And how will, I'm gonna ask you this one too. How will we hold districts and schools accountable absent the already problematic statewide mandatory testing?
So you asked me a few questions. I'll try to remember. I'll try to remember one or two.
We're trying to get them all in before we have to go.
I understand. So first of all, I'd like to respond to Representative Duplessis. That was quite humorous. I'd been on the job less than a week, and he calls with this challenge. We talked it through, and then seemingly a few days later, he says, "Hey, I need you to come over here and help me with this bill that I'm introducing." And I said, well, what time do you need me there? And he says, 1 o'clock. And I said, well, it's already 1:30. No, that's not a true conversation. That's just what it felt like. But we are glad to partner with Representative Duplessis on this. I did hire at the department a position that had not previously existed. I hired an assistant superintendent for equity, access, and opportunity. And all of those words are part of that title for a reason. I hired this individual because I think I know she's capable and competent, but also I need her to push us. And I need that lens of equity to be there in every team meeting, in every executive level meeting, to make sure that when it's not there, we're pushed to make sure that it is there. And I think that having that position at the table will be really important for us as we move forward. And I think the comments are spot on. We need to look in terms of not just the challenges that African Americans have faced throughout the history, but what are the contributions as well? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times the conversations sometimes stem, and maybe rightfully so, just around challenges that have been faced and overcome. but there are so many contributions that need to be examined as well. And I think kids need to be able to read books and learn about these contributions and how they can be like that person when they grow up. And so we've already begun a process to look at curriculum, look at the text that we're offering to make sure that they do offer a diversity in terms of the things that children are being exposed to. We look forward to working with Representative Duplessis and his peers on the Education Committee Task Force to make sure that we don't have gaps in our educational system in this most important issue. But we also need to realize that, you know, studies are coming out, or studies have come out that show that children of color are coming to kindergarten sometimes a year behind on average white students. And so I shared with Representative Duplessis a research article around this a month ago because I need this information to help guide policy decisions. When we talk about early childhood education, I tend to think that it's the most important educational challenge of our generation, and not just quantity of early childhood education, but quality early childhood education programs. You know, in Louisiana, if you look at reading levels, 43% of our kids come to kindergarten not ready, roughly. By first grade, we have about 54% that are on task. By second grade, it's about 56%. So we make progress, but we're so far behind from the beginning that we're playing catch-up mode. So we have to look at all these different things. So much of it does take money, but I believe that we get there. And one of the ways that we get there, and it's the reason I hired this position, to have this position at the table, we have to make sure every child, regardless of race, has access. We have to make sure that they have opportunity. And I can share with the group later the study about African-American children coming to school behind white peers by 9 months in math and 7 months in reading offline, so you can share that out. That's out of Rutgers University.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, I have two more questions I'd like to ask before we ask the very final question and close out, if that's possible. So the first one's going to be to you, Dietra, and then the last one's going to be to Dr. Latson-Billings. So the report that I just quoted, Opportunity Agenda, nationally they said $23 billion is how much more funding predominantly white school districts receive compared with districts that serve mostly students of color. This disparity has real implications on the educational experiences of public education students. So Ms. Johnson-Burrell, as a former leader in the educational advocacy space and your work in philanthropy with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, can you talk to us a little bit about the role of philanthropy in ensuring educational equity?
Ms. Johnson-Burrell, you're
Back on mute. There you go.
Can you hear me now? All right, great. I'm not sure. My little trick wasn't working this time. Thank you. So what I was saying is that philanthropy writ large has played a broad role in education and educational reform. And what I'll say, I want to break this question in two parts. I want to talk a little bit about the W.K. Kellogg Foundation's approach to racial equity in education and what our role is, and then sort of the sector writ large. And I'll start with the sector writ large. I think what we know is that even philanthropy, there are clear racial disparities in how philanthropic money flows, particularly to organizations led by Black and brown folk. Those disparities are significant. And the field is reckoning with this broader issue of sort of having race-neutral grant making to racial disparities. And I think actually there's room for this conversation to be had in policy writ large. Like, I just think that we cannot continue to have a race-neutral approach to addressing racial disparities. And that has really elevated most recently in the field. And how do we begin to address, so the work is often in service of BIPOC communities, but then the funding is rarely given to organizations led by BIPOC populations. With that being said, I want to pivot to the Kellogg Foundation's approach to racial equity. And I want to say this, like even as a preface, is that I say this with all humility. The foundation considers racial equity, community engagement, and leadership as a part of its DNA. So for us, what that means is that it is not just what we fund, it is how we work. And I would say that writ large, like I know it's really popular right now for folks to have a racial equity approach. The foundation decided to become an anti-racist organization, codified that decision in 2007. And we are doing our work inside the organization. And so whether that's in leadership, human resources, grant making, procurement, who do we contract with, who do we partner with, as well as our investing. And that's the kind of walk, like that's what racial equity has to look like in action. That being said, I think then that lens, of course, then has to be applied when we talk about strategies that are intended to improve the educational outcomes of children. Like really looking at not just what the work is intended to do, but the theories of change behind that work, because there's often deficitized frames behind the work. So you have to pull back the layers. So I'll say that to say, like, that's the work that's happening inside the foundation. And philanthropy, our role really, I think, is to catalyze. Our funds are a sliver compared to the funds at LDE. We have a partnership with LDE now, and compared to the money from the state, it's like a sliver in the bigger continuum. So it's also important that those values translate into the public sphere. And I think that's as important that we bring that with us.
So as we shift from the money now to the classroom experience, Dr. Ladson-Dillings, what are your thoughts on ensuring that districts shape the students' classroom experience, whether it's in person or virtually, to make certain that teachers are properly trained in trauma-informed practices as well as culturally relevant pedagogical practices? And I know we have very little time. This is a very big question, but if you can attempt to answer it and also define what culturally relevant pedagogy is, because a lot of folks out there don't really know.
So I am going to pick up a little bit on what Dr. Johnson-Burrell was speaking of too, because what's at the root of our problem with inequity in funding is that we have a funding model that doesn't work. Mm-hmm. It's based on property taxes. That's never going, it's going to always be inequitable as long as that's the way we do it. And that's a bigger question for a bigger time, but just have that in the back of your heads that, you know, we're now saying you're only worth as much as your property. And that's an inhumane way to do schooling. But your question is about culturally relevant pedagogy, and that's really my wheelhouse. It's a term I coined over 30 years ago to describe those teachers who seem to get the absolute best out of our children, no matter where they were. I worked in a very poor, economically and poor performing district and found these 8 stellar teachers who were outperforming their counterparts in those very same schools. So we knew we were drawing from the same student population. And there were 3 things that those teachers did that I think I have now, essentially argued are the core of culturally relevant pedagogy. They had a laser-like focus on student learning. And I've used the term student learning specifically. I didn't say academic achievement because when I say that, people go straight to their state tests. We know that kids learn a lot more than we can test. So while testing is a part of it and it tells us something, it doesn't tell us everything. When people want to use the test as a holy grail, I say to them all the time, well, if you think testing is the be all end all, then you must assume that the best drivers in an American society are 16-year-olds because they did pass the test. And we all know they can't drive, none of them, right? So let us not allow the test, let's not have the tail wag the dog here. Assessment needs to be a lot more robust. We need to do more formative things to see how kids are doing along the way. So this laser-like focus on student learning is one of the components. The second component is what we've called cultural competence. That is to appreciate the language, the culture, the customs, the traditions that students bring with them, don't denigrate them, but to give them access and fluency in at least one other culture. Now, typically for Black kids, we're talking about making sure they get access to what we think of as the mainstream. But it's to get that access without telling them the way your big mama talks is wrong. That's never going anywhere. That you can't sell that. Because Big Mama loves me. Big Mama nurtures me. Big Mama's the one that's gonna make that baked macaroni and cheese, not you, right? So our kids have this connection with home and family that we don't want to break. So that cultural competence is appreciating what they bring and then extending it and adding on more. But the third component, which I think is so critical and I rarely see happen, is what I've called the critical consciousness. It's the so what question. I used to teach history, US history. Trust me, I get that question all the time. Why we gotta learn this, right? Because it seems so irrelevant. And most teachers have a hard time answering that question. If we can't answer that question for kids, there's no reason for them to be invested in what we're trying to teach them. So the critical consciousness that ought to be a part of learning, and I think about in this moment that we're in, you know, our science teachers ought to be teaching about viruses and the way they spread and how they operate and duplicate. Our social studies teachers ought to be talking about the unequal distribution of the disease. Why is it that there are more African Americans and Latinx people getting this disease? Is there anything genetic happening, or is there some social concerns that make them, quote, the essential workers, that they have to be in more dense settings? I mean, there's so much we can do with the world that the kids are living in. So those three things, the academic achievement or the student learning, the cultural competence, and then this critical or socio-political consciousness constitute this thing that I've called culturally relevant pedagogy. And when I've seen it at work, I have seen students soar.
Dr. Latson Billings, there's one question, and you were speaking about this, but if you could add on strategies needed to occur to reshape teacher education programs. And I think you're speaking to this, but this person, Daryl, is mentioning that this is where the real change will happen in the classroom. So if there's any other strategies you'd like to add on reshaping teacher education programs before we close.
Thank you for reminding me of that. You know, teacher education has its own problems. It is, it's largely white teacher educators who themselves have limited experiences with students of color. It's largely, particularly among elementary teachers, is largely white, middle income, monolingual English, Christian, women. That's kind of our pipeline. And until we do some more exciting things for recruiting different kinds of people. So I've been in this never ending fight, and I may actually am starting to win a few battles about having teacher education engage with our division of athletics. Because I was on the athletic board for 7 years. I was the faculty rep to the Big Ten, and I kept running into African-American football and basketball athletes who said, oh, you're in education? You know, I've always wanted to be a teacher. But they're literally cut off from what we're trying to do because we set up a bunch of hoops in both places, both in schools and colleges of education, as well in divisions and departments of athletics. This is a wonderful place to bring these young people together. We've got to recruit more people who look like the kids in our schools, and then our students in teacher education need the opportunity to get outside of themselves, to spend more time in communities. At the same moment, they have to understand that they themselves come to school, come to the university with a culture. You know, that culture is not that thing those other people have. We all have culture. And when our students recognize that what they have is not just, quote, the norm, but it is a specific culture that emerged in a specific context over a specific period of time, they can begin to appreciate that other people have it too, that it's not just this thing, that exotic thing that those people have. There is no us and them. I tell my students all the time, there's only us. if we blow this planet up, trust me, it's going to be all of us blown up. So we've got to have an understanding that, you know, and I know one of the things we keep saying about the pandemic is we're all going through this. Well, I like to say we're all going through the storm, but we're not all in the same boat. See, some people's on yachts. Some people on cruise liners. They can work from home. They're still getting paid. They don't have to work. They have high-speed internet. And some people are in little rowboats doing their best to try to bail that water out of there. So those already in place inequities are exacerbated by any kind of catastrophe. And I think schooling will be no different.
Okay. So as we end this session, and this has been extremely wonderful, and I thank everyone here for your participation in this panel. It has very much educated, not just myself, I'm going to speak for myself, but I'm sure everyone that has been listening. So I do have one final question, and this question is going to sort of transition us from panel 1 to panel 2. And there's a saying in New Orleans, well, in Louisiana, you got to do what you want to, but it's not do what you want to. You do what you want to because you have to. So we have to do it this way because we're running out of time. So I'd like to ask this question as at the same time we transition from panel 1 to panel 2, okay? And so the question is this: if perfect was real, if equity was not just an ideal and it was actually a real thing, what grace would you imagine for public education? So in other words, how do we see public education in the coming years after we work through all of these problems? How do we want to see public education in New Orleans? Well, in the state, let's say the state. We'll save New Orleans for panel 2. So that's our final question as we move to panel 2. So how do you see education? And Dr. Lasson-Billings, we could say nationally, how do you see it?
Well, my first inclination is to quote the late Don Meredith and tell you if ands, and buts was candy and nuts, it'd be Christmas every day. So, you know, you're talking about an ideal. But I really think that what's missing in our discourse is the fact that we have so pulled back from this notion of the public. Again, I don't want to just talk about public schools. I'll tell my age in this one, but I am a child of the late 50s and the 60s, and I grew up in the city of Philadelphia, where if you wanted to go somewhere, you got on public transportation because it was safe, dependable, and inexpensive. I got my polio vaccines at the public health clinic.
I did too.
It was safe, dependable, and inexpensive.
Right.
My family members who struggled economically, they were living in tenements, but when they were finally able to get on the list of that public housing, at that time it was safe, dependable, and inexpensive. And if you had any chance of seeing your children rise above you, you sent them to public school because they were safe, they were dependable, they were inexpensive. Can I tell you that those first 3 things that I've talked about have pretty much gone away? That nobody wants to ride public transportation. We want to ride our own cars. We don't want to go to the public health clinic. We want our own doctor. We don't want to be thinking about public housing. In fact, in Chicago, we've imploded them. We don't even want to have them anymore. And I've seen what happened post-Katrina to some of the public housing in New Orleans. So that's not there. And I'm telling you, public education is this last little domino that's teetering. We have got to get the public back in public education. We have got to get the public back on our side. That would be ideal for me, when we a place where we are all invested as the public, not as a dirty word, but as the bedrock of democracy. So I'll stop right there.
All right, thank you very much. Anyone else want to answer that question before we end and move on to panel 2?
Dr. Akbar, I would like to offer not everything that's possible, because we certainly could talk about a number of things and innovations and all the different places and their places will be beyond this. But one thing I think that we should consider is the fact, and I think it's relevant to this conversation, and it's something I have been talking about for many years now. We have a teacher shortage in certain areas: high school science, high school math, special education, English as a second language. But we also have a teacher shortage in teachers of color. And right now, in the state of Louisiana and the nation, you're going to see about 2% of America's teachers be African American male. And I think that that really is a place where we could lean in and figure out what are the barriers that are preventing that from happening? And could we actually, over the next 3-4 years, move that percentage up? And I think that that is something that is possible. And so I offer that on this conversation because I know many people are watching it, but I know many people will watch it. And so if anyone wants to partner with me or us at the department to help tackle that issue, that's certainly something that we would like to have conversation around, because we need our children of color to see role models that look like them in schools. And I think it's really important. And I want to be part of that solution.
Excellent.
We stand ready to partner with you, Dr. Brimley at Xavier.
Yes, we do.
Just FYI, yeah.
Ms. Johnson-Burrell, Deidre?
Okay. I would undergird what's already been said. Certainly what Dr. Ladson-Billings says about the promise of American democracy is really anchored in public institutions. But what equity really looks like, for me, it looks like schoolhouses as places of love, joy, fun, and possibility. It looks like education where every child can see him or herself in the content and see the world as their learning canvas. It looks like educators deeply steeped in pedagogy. It looks like critical and liberatory curriculum and instructional practices. It looks like BIPOC teachers teaching all learners, not just other children of color, but white students early in their educational experience, because I think that'll do so much for all the things we believe possible in our democracy. And finally, its products look like individuals who are fully self-actualized to pursue the fullness of their God-given gifts and talents.
Representative Duplessis.
Sure. Just briefly, again, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and thank you to Xavier. I'm certainly a proud alum, and I just really appreciate the work that you all continue to do. From my standpoint, I'll kind of end it where we started it. We kind of talked about the political narrative, and I'll use the analogy of all of the political discourse that has taken place around whether or not we should be wearing masks, whether or not we should be told to wear masks, and that whole ridiculous conversation. If we, for once, were able to really look at public education as a shared responsibility, just like we should when it comes to masks, that me wearing a mask has less to do with my concern for self and more to do with my concern for my fellow man and woman, then I think then we will see a public education system in the way in which we should, right? If we romanticized about our public schools the way that we do around small businesses thriving, then we would see the level of investment in our public education system in the way that we should, because there really aren't any barriers or reasons to stop more investment when it comes to saving our small businesses. And that's not a knock or attack on small businesses, but I'm just using that as an example of how we should be equally as committed to investing in making sure that that access is available to all children, despite where you might live, despite your background, or how much your community pays in property taxes, or whatever it might be. And if we saw that as a gain for us all, then I think that we would truly have an education system that's one that I dream of. That's one that I envision, and one that the word equity isn't just a word, but it's reality. And because right now it's just we're talking about it a lot, but achieving it is something much different. So just seeing it more as a shared responsibility. It's not just my child, but all of these children are our children.
Excellent. So we have a hard reset, shared responsibility, making sure that our children have who they need in front of them, that look like them, who may not look like them, but have them in their heart. And so we want to thank this esteemed panel for answering these questions and being in dialogue and conversation with us. I know I guess we got to do the snap because you can't hear the claps. So so we thank you so much. And as we're transitioning now, we're going to ask David, David, do you want them to go ahead and panel 2 to go ahead and come on now, or do you
Yes.
want to end?
Yes, so as we welcome our second panel to come up, Dr. Brumley, Representative Duplessis, the future Dr. Ms. Johnson-Burrell, Dr. Ladson-Billings, and Dr. Akbar for her skillful moderation. Thank you for an informative and engaging dialogue. We are indebted to you for sharing your wisdom with us today, and we are most grateful. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Please stay on panel 1 if you like. Continue with the conversation if you like. All righty. Should I go ahead and start since we're a little bit behind, or you want to give them a couple of minutes?
No, let's do it.
All right, let's do it. All right, panel 2, how are you doing?
Our panel 2.
All right, very good. This is our esteemed panel 2. We're going to go ahead and introduce our panel 2 before we throw them the hard questions that we would like for them to answer for us today. And also we want to acknowledge that we had a lot of questions from the audience that we did not ask panel 1 because these questions seem to be more appropriate for panel 2. So we will get to some of these questions during panel 2. So for panel 2, we have the esteemed Ethan Ashley, I almost said it, Ethan Ashley, who is the board president and District 2 board member of Orleans Parish School Board. We have the esteemed Robert Bell, who is the principal of Lake Forest Charter School. One of the more high-performing schools in the city, have been high-performing consistently, and not only high-performing, but high minority. We have Adrinda Kelly, who's the executive director of the Black Education for New Orleans organization. We have Mary Moran, the executive director of Nuestra Voice. We have Dr. Keisha Smith, who is the Louisiana State Director of the Education Trust. And we also have Dr. Ashanta Wyatt, who is our resident consultant in Orleans Parish, as well as our community activist. And Adrinda, Mary, Keisha, and Ashanta, you all have esteem in front of your name as well. You know, I had 3 kids. I had to always remember, you gotta treat one like you treat the other, all right? So you all have esteem in front of your name as well. So we welcome you to this discussion. I'm sure a lot of you all have heard the discussion prior to this one. It's very, very rich and very, very needed. And so we're gonna take these same questions and ask them with a more localized perspective. So I'm gonna do something a little differently with this particular panel, and I'm gonna ask you the last question first. So we're going to lead off with the same question that we ended with panel 1. And that is, and I didn't read the entire question because of time, so I'm going to read the entire question now. So invoking Toni Morrison's beloved and baby Suggs in the sermon in the clearing, Morrison wrote, she told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine, that if they could not see it, they would not have it. So the question is, if perfect was real and equity was not just ideal, what grace would you imagine for public education? What is the educational system that you see and that we need to see so that we can have it? So if perfect and was real and equity was not just ideal, what grace would you imagine for public education? What is the educational system that you see so that we can see it also and we can have it?
Is it okay if I answer that?
Please do.
So when we talk about grace and what we see, I would just like the opportunity for children to be seen as just that, children with possibility, no matter their zip code, no matter where they come from. And I think if we want to talk perfection, then we have to take politics out of education. As politicized as it is, it loses its focus. Education is supposed to be the great equalizer, but you can't equalize anything if it's not accessible to all children across all communities. And so for me, I would take politics out of it, personal agendas out of it. And I would also like to take this idea of privatizing and monetizing public education. And so if we can seek perfection, I would want to put students at the front of that, and what is best for all kids, no matter who they are or where they come from. They all deserve a fighting chance, and that is to level the playing field and to give every child what they need equitably.
Thank you.
I'll jump in here and offer that, you know, when we talk about systems, we're talking about laws, policies, practices, budgets, and people, you know, create those laws, practices, policies, budgets. And so when I think about the grace, you know, that I imagine, I think about people who are whole and healed, you know, and because they're whole and healed, they're creating different kinds of laws, practices, and policies so that our systems, you know, move from harm to being systems that are more restorative, joyful, affirming, et cetera. I think also about, you know, we're talking about the education system, but we know that schools are located in communities. And so when I think about what will make the education system that I dream about possible, I think about a well community. So I think about things like universal basic income, you know, things like access to healthcare for all, things like, you know, food stability and access for all. How can we move towards that such that we create an environment where children are coming to school well, their families are well?
Anyone else want to answer that question, folks?
I'll just add to that. I think for me, it's about also repairing the harm, right? And if, you know, the harm that was experienced was has been collective, then so do those solutions need to be collective, need to be based off of, you know, culture, need to be based off of tradition, and sort of thinking about how do we, you know, the expansion, not just of the school, but its connection to community and its connection to families and its connection to our traditions and our culture.
So moving from that question, I'd like to ask this question, and this one is specifically for Keisha, Ashanta, and Robert. So for the past 4 months, has been very historical and transformative. It was remarkable to see the world wake up one morning and in unison demonstrated that the masses are no longer accepting the status quo. Yet the data continues to support findings that public schools are not necessarily safe spaces for brown and black students. And I hate that as a teacher, because as a teacher, I want it to be a safe space for all kids, but particularly the children that live in my community. So Dr. Smith, Dr. Wyatt, and soon to be Dr. Bell, in light of COVID-19 and the nation's current moment of racial reckoning, what do you feel are the major issues within public education now? And Dr. Wyatt, you have kind of alluded to this in your answer earlier, so if it's a repeat, it's okay. Go right ahead, Dr. Smith and Dr. Bell, Dr. Wyatt.
Yeah, so I can, there's several issues, but I will have to say the top three that come to mind is, I mean, of course, with schools continuing virtual learning, digital access remains a priority. And this isn't just about access to internet and access to computers, which is important, but also supporting parents and teachers in a virtual environment, whether that's technical support, professional development. And I know the last question talked about grace and giving them grace. You know, teachers and parents, I mean, we this is new for everybody, right? And I think we also need to give everyone grace in this moment. Some additional issues to prioritize really include like getting a grasp on like the learning loss that could have possibly happened since schools were closed in March. There's a report by Northwest Evaluation Association that estimates that students could have missed anywhere from 30% to almost a full year of learning. And another report that suggests that Black students may fall behind by 10 months, Latinos by 9, and students from low-income families by almost a year. And I'm sure, like, I've even heard stories of students who were making gains before COVID hit, and now we just don't know. We don't know if those gains will be lost, if they're behind even more. And I think we really do need to focus on seeing where these kids are, whether that's through diagnostic testing when kids come back, to make sure that we can meet their academic and social emotional needs. and speaking of social emotional needs, that would be my next top one. We want to make sure that students have physically and emotionally safe environments, whether they're learning virtually or in school. I mean, when students have come from families where people have died, right? Like not just people in the family, teachers have died or have gotten sick from COVID. We see the economic impact of that from job loss. And so all of these things like increase stress and anxiety. And so when kids either come back to school or participate in virtual learning, it is possible that some of their behavior may be misinterpreted as misbehaving when it really is just reactions to stress and anxiety. And so I can go on, but I'll go ahead on and defer to the other panelists.
Okay.
So I'll jump in. As a practitioner, for me, it's really about filling the larger gaps that have been created due to this health crisis. And so we're talking financial learning gaps, school and community gaps, family gaps. And so as a practitioner, just trying to figure out how do we operationalize this new way of living and educating our children and making sure that they have the best opportunity to learn.
So for me, when I think about the issues, I think about this disconnect between community and school. I think about this decentralized system that we have specific to New Orleans that has charter management operators unaccountable to community, unaccountable to families, even unaccountable to the Orleans Parish School Board. There's a definite disconnect there that is obvious to community stakeholders such as myself and parents such as myself. So I think that is a pressing issue. And lastly, I think about, conversations based in solutions are often overshadowed by this idea that it's a public versus charter school conversation, when in actuality, we only want to merge the things that were working traditionally for public schools with the things that are now working for charter schools and marry the two so that we can meet the needs of all children across the entire city and eventually across the state of Louisiana. Because if one child is left behind, then we have not done our due diligence to serve all children equitably. And that is my issue. That is my push at all times. I don't want to discount the things that are working for charter schools. I appreciate those things. But they actually discounted the things that were working in public, traditionally run schools, neighborhood community schools. And I think they did so at a disservice and an injustice to an entire community. And that is our problem. And I think that is the most pressing thing right now, is this idea that it's a us against them mentality, a school against parent mentality. We have to come together holistically to better serve our kids.
So that's one of the things that came up earlier in panel one about how we need to work together in unison, not just here in New Orleans, but throughout the United States. And so I'm going to go to the next question then, and I'm going to pose this question to Mr. Ashley, Ms. Moran, and to Ms. Kelly. And that is, given all of the trauma that our students, our children are experiencing, not just from death and sickness and from their parents losing their job, but not being with their school family. That's very traumatic also, whether it's a charter school, a public school, a Catholic school. What's inside those buildings are the children's school family. So I pose this question to you. How does trauma-informed practices and culturally relevant pedagogy fit into the narrative? And not just the narrative of the school, but the narrative of the community, the narrative of the district. How do these things fit into the narrative? And we'll start with you, Mr. Ashley, since you're the president of the school board.
Well, I appreciate that.
Okay.
I've always been taught ladies first, but I appreciate that at this moment.
Yeah, because I'm gonna have the ladies come back behind me. They're gonna talk to you about what you just said.
So I'm sure they're gonna fix whatever. I'm sure they'll fix whatever it is that I miss or say wrong. Let me start by saying it's essential, right? It's probably one of the top things that we have to deal with as a district. Next to the technology gaps that Dr. Smith talked about, that we need to make sure that we address. This is essential, and I will tell you that our district made some commitments to shift monies. We actually went to the state legislature in 2019 to shift money from our schools preservation fund in the tune of about $10 million to be able to create a student needs fund, right? And we started shifting money to student supports and programs. And that shift in dollars and investment was really for the mental health supports for students and other programming that we know is essential. And so I want to also just say thank you to my dear brother and friend, Representative Royce Duplessis. He was in the legislature at that time, and so I just want to thank him for that, for allowing us to do that. Now I will tell you the surveys we surveyed our families this summer to talk about what's happening with these two twin pandemics that we're facing in this moment. And one of the things that was highlighted at the top of the list was definitely trauma-informed practices. And so I want to acknowledge that it's not just essential from the district standpoint, it's essential from our parents and our families saying we need these types of services for not just our students, but also for our teachers. And our staff, since 2019 has made investments both with teaching and providing trainings to teachers, and then also providing more dollars to programming to support mental health supports and trauma-informed practices. And I will say most recently, as in yesterday, in our 4-hour committee of a whole meeting, this board passed forward a request for proposal for professional development service for trauma-informed services from organizations providing these services to our district. And that investment is a 2-year investment that we're making as a district, and we'll vote on that on Thursday. So, we are listening to community, but I think at the end of the day, I'll say it's essential, and I'm sure, my fellow panel members will say, some similar and go deeper. So, I'll leave it there. Our district believes it's essential, and we're investing, putting money up necessary to start to move the needle in that way.
Okay. Mary Ardrenda?
So one of the researchers that I've been reading a lot lately is a gentleman named Dr. Sean Jenwright. And he talks a lot about how we need to broaden or redefine, trauma. And what he's talking about is that we often talk about trauma as an individual experience, right? Some experience that has an impact on an individual. And what he suggests, as have others also suggested this, is that COVID-19 in particular has helped give a shared language and shared experience around how there are underlying factors, right, that contribute to the individual traumatic experiences that a person is manifesting, right? And he's coined this term, persistent traumatic stress environment, I believe, to talk about that. And so if your question is about what is the connection between trauma-informed practices and culturally relevant pedagogy, from my point of view, and really channeling, what I'm learning as I dig into Dr. Jenwright's research, to talk about trauma-informed practices requires strategies, right, that equip us to address the underlying factors, right, that actually create the individual traumatic responses that we're seeing children and families deal with. And so the housing policies, the education policies to bring it closer to home. How are schools funded? What are we teaching? Who gets access to what schools? So on and so forth. And so that really gets at the heart of what one of the key aspects of culturally relevant pedagogy, as Dr. Latson-Billings was describing earlier, that critical consciousness, right, about our environment and how to actually develop the agency to shift the policies that are oppressing us. And so when we talk about that intersection, we're actually talking about making a commitment to developing learners who are equipped to challenge those structures and practices. And, to be quite frank, I'm not sure that all of us understand public education as needing to serve that purpose.
Yeah, and I think building on that, I think it also means the acknowledgement of, as I was saying earlier, that if there's collective trauma that's happening, then that collective trauma needs to be addressed, but also those who can help to heal that aren't just necessarily folks who work within the clinical space, right? And I think that is something that we often get very confused. right? By trauma informed, we think that that's someone with, clinical experience, when we know that, that there's so much of the harm that goes beyond education. And so thank you for talking about that, Dren. But then also going beyond sort of this clinical, yes, our people need mental health services, et cetera, but there's so much more that is encompassed in when we talk about, trauma-informed practices, culturally relevant pedagogy, specifically this, are we developing critical learners, right? As an organizer, our work is so much about developing leadership and leadership development, knowing that one of the major pieces of leadership development for us is this piece around political education, which really can take a long time. Many of us were, not politicized through the schools that we attended. Many of us were politicized in the community. Many of us were politicized when we took that first ethnic studies course in college, right? And so why we don't have ethnic studies, Black studies, classes in our schools now, that's what would sort of allow us to know that we're moving the needle on that, when in addition to sort of this piece around mental health and trauma, that we're also building these other pieces that when we think about it in its most expansive way.
Can I just jump in for a second and just add something to that? When we're talking about, this piece on culturally relevant pedagogy, and when we're talking about mental health, I think it's important that we center mental health professionals in educational arenas the same way we center teachers. I think mental health professionals are often afterthoughts, reactionary. I think they ought to be on the front end of planning the opening of schools, the way that the teachers are planning the opening of schools, because kids are going to come to us traumatized. We are not equipped as educators to handle the trauma-informed practices and care that they deserve. So we ought to center our mental health professionals, particularly those of color, in our buildings when they open, so that they can work with us on the front end and not on the back end reactionarily, if that makes sense.
That's an excellent suggestion. Actually, we started doing that at Xavier. So the counseling department and the education department, we work together in training our students in each other's professions because of just what you're saying. So thank you for that suggestion. So Tanisha, yeah, go ahead, Mary. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I also think a part of the conversation that we're having nationally, right, around defunding the police, and specifically around the divestment of policing and policing of behaviors in schools, right, policing of students, it also means the investment of, right, and so like that investment really, if we're talking about, in this case, teachers, social workers, also being able to have the training that we have currently is not sufficient, right? The training that we have currently is not based on liberatory practices. It's not based off, whether you're talking about social work, whether you're talking about teaching. And so there is a real need there that is not being addressed.
Correct.
Dr. Akbar, can I just very quickly, I have to say this as the president, we as a board, would be nowhere without the leadership of Dr. Kelly Jordan, who's leading that work on behalf of our district. And I always think it's really important to acknowledge the people who are doing the work within the district. This is not an Ethan Ashley thing. I'm not trained in informed practices and trauma, but Dr. Kelly Jordan is, and that's the work that she does. And I think she's brilliant at it. And I just want to make sure that I toot her horn as I speak in this moment.
All right, thank you very much. I'm glad to see the district moving in that direction, because it's more than just coloring the white picture black. We have to go very deep into the roots as to how to solve these problems. So thank you very much. So what we're going to do now, I'm not going to ask the gazillion questions that I have, because we have a gazillion more from the public. So I'm going to stop asking my questions. I'm going to turn it over to Tanisha so she can ask the questions that are being posed by our audience. Tanisha.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up, thank you, Dr. Akbar, a question that was mentioned in the last, or asked in the last panel, but I think it relates here, and Dr. Wyatt had began speaking about this in her first point. And so it is in New Orleans, the public is not on the side. So the conversation was about bringing the community back into public education, bringing the public back into public education, and kind of this idea of mistrust between the community and the education system, as Dr. Wyatt had been mentioning. So the question that this person, Alexis, brings up is, what can we do to get them back on our side, the public back on the side of public education in New Orleans, and how can we rebuild the trust? And that can go to anyone.
Well, first, I would like to answer that by stating, at the end of it all, we all have a responsibility to it. And I think too often, the responsibility only lies on one group of people. The greatest thing about trauma and challenging times is that it wakes the giant up to be able to look at what actually going on. And so as an example, Hurricane Katrina allowed more people to begin to participate in public education and understand the nuances of that. And so for me, it's really about time and systems and people participating cooperatively to get the job done for the same population that we all want to support. So as an example, the practitioners such as myself and the advocates in the different arenas and the different spaces and the politicians, for us to have more of a vertical alignment in the direction that schools should go in and not these facets. And I'll go back to what Dr. Wyatt said about it's not a us against them. It's really a us for us and we for all, because we all wind up dealing with the consequences of not working together as a group. And so I'm happy for these times that we're in, these rough times, so that would help us kind of shape where we need to go. And so that's the way I see it.
Can I just jump on that and just say that as a district, we have a responsibility to, you know, when we do things wrong and we don't live up to the expectations of community, we have to do like we tell young people. When you make a mistake, you need to apologize and you need to make a plan on how you're not going to harm someone again and be clear about that. And in our district, you know, as leaders, and myself being one of them, I need to make sure that we are being clear about that truth. But then we also need to make sure that it's not just top down. It can't be the plan from the school board president. It has to be, you know, I think our surveying and listening to community more is the right way to go. Hearing from our teachers, our educators, the folks who do this work every day. I think that's really important. So I want to state that as the leader of the board, I think we have to do a better job, myself included, hearing from, listening to, and making sure that we are being responsive in our stances to apologize when we're wrong, and to work with community to make sure that it is not a top-down thing, and that we're working collectively. And that's the only way we're going to be able to do that. We got to put our pride aside and move together collectively.
So as with Katrina, and the same with what's going on now, a lot of our, I'm not sure what you would call it. Well, it definitely uncovers some of the challenges that we have here in, not just in New Orleans, but all throughout the United States. So with that question, Tanisha, I believe the second part of that question is, how do we bring the community together? How do we actually bring everyone to the table so that we can actually have conversation with one another and then develop solutions that are actionable? So how do we do that? And I think that's a question we've been asking ourselves for the last 15 years. So how do we do that?
I think, you know, was it last week? We had a press conference on Monday, right? That press conference asked for exactly this, and what we're talking about right now, right? Which was that New Orleans public schools and charter management organizations engage parents, that they move the start date back until they were able to engage parents. The very next day, NOLA Public Schools stood with the mayor, stood with, you know, and again, we understand the importance of reopening schools. I think it was just how things, instead of, it was the day before, right? So you heard us, right? And they stood and didn't address that issue at all, addressed more so issues again around the data, the science of reopening schools, which parents are not against reopening schools, parents want to be engaged. And so, and citing that, the survey and the survey process that they had gone through, parents say that that's not sufficient. And NOLA Public Schools then turned the responsibility on to schools. Again, this decentralization, specifically who is responsible, who is accountable to who, that buck continues to get passed around, which makes it very difficult for parents to know who to trust. And specifically, parents are tired. They said that, we've been fighting, and when we had those conversations and very hard accountability that came after Hurricane Katrina, people who were in power, specifically New Orleans Public Schools, the Louisiana Department of Education, Bessie, and every board in between, said that they understood that they were moving without community and that they shouldn't do that anymore and that they wouldn't do that anymore. But clearly we have another example of how that's actually being done now.
So it's hard to break bad habits, unfortunately. It takes a little time.
Can I get a question in here,
yes.
Dr. Axel?
Yes.
Can I add a question in here? So Mary, you just talked about trust, and there's a question from Kristen Burris, who's one of my favorite scholars on this subject of public charter schools in New Orleans. And her question is this. Considering charter school scandals in New Orleans, the recent Kennedy High School debacle in which the school did not ensure that students were offered required courses for graduation, and the fact that nearly half of the city's charter schools are rated D or F by the state, how can we entrust our children's education to charter operators during a time of crisis when they could not function successfully prior to COVID-19? Is this the time to demand well-resourced neighborhood public schools staffed with experienced Black educators? Charters have had 15 years to get this right. Most have failed miserably. What does this mean for the current moment? And in full disclosure, I'm a charter school board member, so.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it, but I know I just took up time.
Let me get in here and just shout out to Dr. Burris. I'm a very big fan of your work. So a lot of difficult questions in there, no easy answers, but here's what I'll say. When we talk about public schools, and I'll say public schools because in New Orleans, all of our charter schools are public schools. All of our public schools are charter. So I'll use those terms interchangeably. When we talk about our schools in New Orleans, we tend to paint a broad brush, right? When in fact, I see at least 3 buckets of schools in our city. We have large charter management organizations, so networks that have maybe 4 or more schools in their organization. We have single site schools and small networks, so schools that are standalone, and networks that have 1, 2, possibly 3 sites within their organization. And then we have standalone schools and small network schools that are led and governed by Black people. And that's the space that I sit in, given the work that I do day to day. And the fact of the matter is, the schools in our city, depending on the bucket that they sit in, are having a qualitatively different experience. Certainly as it pertains to COVID-19, but as it pertains to navigating, the last 15 years period. I believe it was Dr. Johnson Burrell who spoke at length on the first panel about some of the resource disparities, right, that exist in our system. And I would lift up that when we talk about some of the challenges and the hard questions that Dr. Burris just answered, I would encourage us to apply that lens that not all schools operating in our space are doing so with the same amount of resources, and that has a very concrete and literal connection to the outcomes that they're able to produce. That being said, I do want to put out there that every issue that we often see amplified in our space, the Kennedy example is the one that was in the question. My point of view is that those issues are often amplified in a context with a Black educator or a Black-led school, and those issues often offer insight into challenges and and failures that are more systemic, right? So I do want to put that out there. I think Dr. Burris is asking some really hard, poignant questions. What I want to not miss the opportunity to do is point out that not all of our schools are having the same experience in our space. And some of the experiences and challenges that get amplified get scapegoated on a particular set of schools when in fact they're systemic challenges.
So it seems like this is excellent time then for a hard reset, as Dr. Lanson Dillon has talked to us earlier about. Is there another question out there that's related to this, Tanisha?
Well, I actually want to jump in and answer that.
Okay, go right ahead.
Let me just add to that. The question, the part of the question that Dr. Burris pointed out was, is this time to go back to a neighborhood structure? I think it's always time for neighborhood schools. I think there's not right time to have a neighborhood school, because neighborhood schools work well specifically for the type of neighborhoods we have in New Orleans. And so I think a lot of the disparities that we're talking about are exacerbated because we don't have access to neighborhood schools. And I would even go further to say that these are disparities by design. It is not by happenstance. It is by design that our kids are being bused from one failing neighborhood, under-resourced neighborhood, across town to another failing school. This is not by chance. This is happening very intentionally. And so in order for us to find real solutions, we have to have real conversations, and we have to talk about the stuff that's uncomfortable. And even when you talk about listening to the community, you can listen to the concerns of the community, but if you don't put their concerns into actionable items or into policy making, then listening to them is moot. You have to do something that caters to educational outcomes for children. And we cannot talk about disparity without talking about the idea that our schools are under-resourced in certain neighborhoods by design. We cannot talk about disparities unless we talk about, you can't call a charter school public when they get to wave the banner of public when it's convenient for them. But when they don't want to answer to the public, when they don't want to answer to parents, then they use this idea that they're private. They don't have to share their records with you. They don't have to produce public records requests because they're a private entity. So they can't have it both ways. So I will implore Ethan Ashley and our entire board to create something that tells the charter operators that they are accountable to us, whether that's through OPSB or whether that's directly to parents. But they don't get to shut us out. They don't get to operate in our communities and shut out the community. You have to talk to the people that are closest to the issue and that are impacted disproportionately by the issues, and that is the community. And I don't like to have this song and dance and we're not talking in truth. These are not public entities because they're not operating publicly. They're able to wave that banner so that they can have access to public funding, but then when parents want to hold them accountable, they say, oh, we're private. We don't have to answer to that, right? So I will push Ethan and the entire board to create something that makes them accountable either to them or to us, or to them and us collectively. But parents and community ought to have access to their children's schools, and we ought to have a voice in decision making.
I agree, and I know that that Ethan, you know this because especially when it is like around boards, right, and the charter management boards, and we went through that process of the task force to really think about what do boards need in order to be more public, to be more transparent, and to be more accountable to the public. And so that need still exists because I do agree that there is this time where, it's like, we don't need to do this, or we don't need to be visible. We don't need to be responsive to community. And so I wonder what a policy would look like that would actually spell out what does the process of reopening look like, right? The task force that NOLA Public Schools had 2 parents on it, right? And when you think about the weight of all of the CMO leaders who were on that task force, you know that the voices of parents were probably not at the same, again, weight, right? Thinking about what I have seen in terms of like, how do we engage community? The how piece is usually schools engage communities based off of their self-interest and not based off of the self-interest of parents and students and teachers. And so making sure that when we call for town halls, that the town hall isn't all about information, but it's really about, and pushing information out, but really being able to get information in. I think that's critical. I think that that's actually a place where NOLA Public Schools, specifically the board, could play in terms of a policy and making sure that boards and CMOs are accountable to parents.
So, Mr. Ashley, you have a lot on your lap. You're getting a lot of direction over there. I know you want to answer these ladies' commentary, but I have a question for you so you can answer.
Please.
A question for you that you can answer, and hopefully you will be able to
weave it all in.
All right.
I got you.
All right. So what Dr. White and I'm gonna call it Dr. Moran is bringing to the table is that there just has to be a lot more community involvement. I mean, we've been saying this for the last 15 years.
Of course.
And in light of COVID-19 and everything that is happening in our communities and in our world, and we also agree that the kids have to go back to school, but we're just not sure how they should go back to school, because we definitely don't want to put them in schools that's in a community that has a high spike as far as COVID-19 is concerned. So in light of this decision by the local school authorities in Orleans Parish to host K-12 public education first online, and then we'll see about them going into the schools, how do you listen to the voice of the community and take care of the educational needs of the children?
Well, I think that's a great question. And, you know, I will tell you that in this moment, it's a very critical moment, I'd say, historically, on where we end up, you know, being where we're at currently, being 15 years outside of Katrina. And then, you know, I'm just thinking, what does it look like to be 15 years outside of COVID-19 and not making sure that we make the same mistakes of our predecessors. And so, you know, in this moment, you know, there's a lot more that needs to be done around communication. And you know, I want to be the first to tell you, criticism in no form or fashion, you know, deserves any type of rebut. You know, it deserves I hear you, and we got to figure out how we address those issues. And we've had the opportunity, Mary has worked with the district on some of these issues around organizing. And so, you know, I know that, and she's a trusted voice, and I believe that we'll get there together around some of these policies, and I will circle up on that. What I will tell you, you know, just even in my mind's eye about how we continue to move forward, there's a couple things that we have to also make sure that we delineate and talk about relative to how we continue to move our system forward, right? And I think we've danced around it a little bit, and you know, I think Dr. Wyatt talked about it, you know, in terms of our communities that exist in New Orleans, and the poverty that exists in our city, and the lack of support all the way around, in the interconnectedness between all of these things in our services that exist for our families and our young people, and the fact that our educators are having to be everything, you know, for all things, and that makes it really difficult for them in the long run to be able to just show up as good and great educators. Because they are now, you know, having to be mental health providers, they're having to be, you know, babysitters, they're having to do all, create safe spaces at home, you know, they're having to do everything. And so, you know, in this moment, I want to acknowledge that, you know, I think Dr. White talked about this earlier. It's going to take a full conversation about how we all can work collectively, from the state to city, to local, because the places that our young people are coming from, the homes that our young people are coming from, they have really good working class parents who are struggling to make ends meet because of, you know, our economy and so on and so forth, right? And all that plays in a piece in how our young people are able to show up in the classroom, and that plays a piece in what our teachers are able to do in supporting our young people to be successful, so that they can self-actualize and thrive. And so, you know, I just want to acknowledge that is a real thing, that we have to figure out how we can all work together to provide our families with better life outcomes, so that their young people can be in our systems, not worried about, you know, just the things that adults worry about. How are we going to keep the lights on? You know, are we going to be able to stay in our house on today? You know, what's going on with food security, all those things. So I just want to acknowledge that. The next thing that I'll say, you know, relative to the challenges where we're at right now, you know, I think we've heard from there's certain things that we need to continue to listen to and listen to families, but there's certain things that we also need to take action on, and I'm talking very clearly about, this access to technology, making sure that connectivity and devices are where they need to be. We need to make sure that we're providing training supports offered to parents in this virtual experience. We've never opened schools virtually before. This is going to be a new experience for everyone. And as someone with a 9-year-old who's going to be, experiencing 4th grade, I'll tell you that this is definitely a new experience for myself as well. Between that, I'm hoping that we get to a place where we're able to innovate and differentiate with each of our young learners in a way with technology, in a way that allows us to be able to meet their needs where they're at. And there has to be continued assessment. I think Dr. Bell talked about that, just continuing assessment of our young people, where they're at today, where they're at, continuously, when we don't have any sign of whether or not testing will continue, or, we didn't have testing last year. So there's just a lot of assessment that needs to take place. Now, undergirded with all this is the fact that we need to continue to do auditing of our system around racial equity practices and policies with people who are actually qualified to do just that. And our district has made the investment there to make sure that we are looking at all of our policies and the disparities that may exist, so that we can continue to get this right for young people in our families. Now, the last thing I'll say is this board, myself in particular, we believe in making sure that we believe in neighborhood schools. And we ultimately would love to have our young people to go to schools within their neighborhood. So much so that we made an investment in policy to give a half-mile radius preference to families, to schools, which is a walking preference. Well, not if you're real young, but a believable walkable preference. And we watched how that has played out in the data in terms of young families choosing to go to schools within their neighborhoods. And that's not necessarily the case. And so, and that's largely because we know that our schools need more resources. And, I think Adrenda said this well, that we have to make sure that everyone is equally resourced not equally, equitably resourced. That's the right answer. And that we give the resources to our young people who need it the most. And the more in which we talk about this system, and I truly believe this is not a us versus Ethan situation. I know I represent the board and I appreciate all of the feedback in this moment, but this is a collective conversation on how we continue to move our district forward within the policies that we have currently, but moving them even further. And I appreciate all of this and I receive it. So
Dr. Smith, what policy supports are needed to ensure that the quality of education for Black and Brown children in particular and their academic progress do not recede, especially here in New Orleans?
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to actually just build on what has already been said. One is that we do need to make sure we get a good grasp on the learning loss. The resource equity piece is huge. We want to make sure that the schools who serve the most high needs kids get the most resources, that we have consistent accountability across the board. And more importantly, that we have data transparency, right? So like community engagement is really important. Hearing public voice is important. And there are things that we can do to be more transparent with the public. And one of those things, data transparency, right? We can have policies that require collection and public reporting of data on school level spending, data on student attendance and engagement, particularly during this time. And really the data related to any student learning loss that may have happened due to COVID, any personnel reductions, how federal stabilization funds are being distributed and used. I mean, if anything, like I would really implore some policies on data transparency. And then I think we can set some guidelines for just consistent outreach for hard to reach families, to connect to those, to make sure schools are really connecting to hard to reach families, whether that's students with limited English speaking students, as well as just students where, again, we don't know what might be happening in their home. I think this is an opportunity where we can use like non-teacher staff, so paraprofessionals, to do one-on-one engagements, again, to make sure like we don't lose kids during this time.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Bell, as a school leader, what steps are you taking and your faculty and your school community to make sure that you maintain the excellence that you've gained over these years, and that the kids perform at the level that they have always performed?
So first we set the standards high, and then we'll make the necessary adjustments. But right now, one focus has been on communicating with the school community. And so we've been communicating with staff, families, our business partners, service providers, just trying to understand how do we operationalize all of these things. We want to make sure that we have all of the resources or tools that our families need to be successful. So we speak about the one-to-one devices, professional development for staff. Our staff has been in professional development since June, and development for our parents, and some of the platforms that we're going to be using. And so we're trying to connect all the dots, putting systems in place to support everyone. And so we try to create the same type of online experience, that distance experience, as we have in the brick and mortar. And so we'll see what adjustments we have to make, but we believe that we're going to have to figure out the instructional practices, how to really streamline those, the safety of our staff and kids, connecting daily with our kids. And so there's a laundry list of things that we have to focus on, but we've been moving with those things I've just listed off to you, to make sure that we are just connecting all the dots as it relates to performance, and as it relates to making sure that our families and kids are highly engaged and our staff are highly engaged in the process of operationalizing this new way of doing education.
Well, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Mr. Bell, for those last comments. I want to thank everyone for your contribution to this conversation. Very, very important conversation. And I think a very important first step in us having a hard reset after this COVID-19, or during this pandemic, and our racial endemic. That's a new word I learned. That we continue this conversation. And I think after 15 years, we should know how to have this conversation in such a way that we can make the kind of progress and develop the kind of educational system, not only that our children deserve, but that we deserve as a community. So thank you very much for participating in this panel discussion. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Robinson Morris, the father of this panel webinar, and thank him again for putting on such a great panel discussion. So Dr. Robinson Morris, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Akbar. Dr. Akbar, you did a wonderful job.
Well, thank you very much.
And you'll be doing the next one too. Thank you. I want to thank Ethan Ashley, Principal Bell, Mary Moran, Adrinda Kelly, Dr. Keisha Smith, and Dr. Ashanta Watt. Thank you for your leadership, for your wisdom, for your commitment to education and to the children of New Orleans. We have much, much work to do, but we have that work to do together, collectively, with, for, and in community, as we learned today. Please allow me also to thank our Q&A facilitator, Tynesha Fields, and my wonderful, wonderful co-moderator, now always moderator, Dr. Renee Akbar. I must also thank those behind the scenes, Yamlak, who's Xavier's IT guru, and Karen Blair, program coordinator for the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit. I joke that Karen is the boss, and she is the boss of the center. And I want to thank each of the audience members who have joined us today for this important dialogue and discussion. My hope is that you'll join us next Thursday for a virtual higher education leadership roundtable with the presidents of Xavier, Dillard, the University of New Orleans, Loyola, and Tulane, to talk about equity within the higher education space and how they are responding to this COVID moment. The more details to come this week. Please also be reminded to stay tuned for a short feedback survey. As always, be well, be community, remember our shared humanity, and be of good courage. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I'll be right back, Dave.
Okay.
My dog decided to go to the bathroom right at the end of the thingy. So went okay? You think it went all right?
Oh, I think it went wonderful. Let's see if we can get the remaining participants logged off, and we can check.
All right. Are they still there?
Yeah, they're still there.